Thank you so much.
All right. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome on in. Hi. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all. Hello, hello. My gosh, look at all these folks here. Well, as you guys are coming in, I'm going to begin our morning by reading a land acknowledgement. We honor the unnamed and named artist whose accumulated knowledge our research in textiles draws from. We commit to respecting and learning from these enduring traditions as we acknowledge the history and presence of Indigenous peoples in the Colorado Front Range. We recognize that we occupy the traditional and ancestral lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne people, whose rich cultural legacy and heritage continue to shape this region. We honor their deep-rooted traditions, including their skilled textile practices, which embody stories, spiritual beliefs, and communal knowledge passed down through generations. These Indigenous communities' intricate beadwork, weaving, and garment making reflect a profound connection to the land and their resilience as artisans and storytellers. So thank you. All right, welcome in everybody this morning. If you could, Laura's gonna do a quick announcement, but please, as always, drop in the chat where you're coming from this morning so we can see where you're at and have a sense of how far away everybody is. So please drop those in the chat and I will hand over the floor to Laura.
I like the virtual floor. It's like it's moved across time and space to me. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another talk in our experimental weaving talk series. I, of course, am introducing, but the series wouldn't happen without the support of Stephen Frost and Etta Sandry, who are both on the call. And this has really been an ongoing series connected to our residency program and our teaching and our work here at the Unstable Design Lab at CU Boulder. This is the Unstable Design Lab with our matching outfits. Don't worry, we're already in the process of coordinating a new matching photo with an updated list of group members. So I know you've been very concerned. That will be coming soon. But we are a research lab at the University of Colorado Boulder. We're really exploring the integration of textiles in engineering context and equitable practices of collaboration between craftspeople, artists, designers, and engineers. One of the major projects we've been working on is AdaCAD. If you have been using AdaCAD, you may have noticed that this week it looks very different. We officially launched our newest version, and that has been really exciting. If you scan this QR code or head over to docs.adacad.org, you'll see an announcement about some upcoming workshops that we're hosting, many at this same time on Wednesdays in weeks alternating the talk series. And we're really hoping that that just helps people get on board. If you're interested in exploring it, if it brings something for you, it's really just kind of an algorithmic and playful approach to drafting. And yeah, we'd love to have you come to the party. Also, if you have missed any talks in our series or just want to relive the moments you loved the most, you're welcome to visit them all on our YouTube archive. Our YouTube channel is the Unstable Design Lab, and you'll see a channel on there called the Experimental Weaving Talk Series. Stephen will upload the talks soon after, and will include a lot of the links that came up in the chat, just so they become sort of living little archives of what happened in this moment. Without further ado, I want to welcome Jovencio de la Paz, who is an amazing and inspiring weaver and artist who we have just talked about as sort of the reason everyone's been weaving waffle. Their work has been incredibly inspiring, and I have to admit I've been lurking in a nearly problematic way in the background, especially as they're integrating different practices of technology and reflections on technology through cloth. I am so excited to welcome them today and to hear what you have to say. And thank you so much, Jovencio, for joining us. I will turn the virtual floor across time and space to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's such an honor to be here today and to share with you some of my work and my research. It's also just incredible to be included in this list of luminary artists and designers. It's quite an honor. I will have to admit, I'm just on the sort of other side of coming off of a pretty severe case of bronchitis. So if there's a little bit of coughing or if I'm stopping a lot to drink water, that's the reason. But really a joy to be here today. I'll go ahead and share my screen and just jump right into the talk. Um, in the last couple of years, maybe the last 2 years, I've been on quite on and off quite a sort of lecture tour. And in that, I've been delivering talks like this really frequently. And some of you may have experienced this in your own sort of journeys with writing your artist presentation. I came to a point where I could not say the same words again. So this is going to be a mix of a lot of new kind of thinking and reflection on my own work, and especially given, I'd say, the sort of sociocultural moment that we're finding ourselves in. I have been thinking a lot about my work, probably in the most sort of fundamental or essential ways, really taking sort of a step back to think about what it is I'm doing at the Loom, why I think it's important. And so I'm going to talk about definitely some projects and some research, but I hope that you'll also indulge me in maybe some more reflective or potentially more philosophical kinds of musings. Um, the first thing that I would like to discuss has been an interesting kind of departure for me in terms of sharing my work and research. And as I described, potentially a little bit more of a fundamental or foundational regard that I have for the loom. And I've been thinking about this primarily because I have realized that the majority of my work and the majority of the sort of research topics that interest me stem directly from the way in which I regard this tool. And I use the word regard very specifically. Um, in many ways, for many years in my practice, the loom has been kind of a tool of curiosity for me, but I have also realized the way in which I regard it as a collaborator. And in many ways, uh, unlike a lot of other processes that I have engaged as an artist over the years, the loom has become a presence in the studio, which I deal with not simply through my own will or agency, but a tool I encounter and regard in many ways as a living collaborator in the way I think and make work. Um, and so the first way that I think about the loom, and in this case, it's the TC2 Jacquard loom, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and work with directly. I think of the loom as an arbiter or perhaps a mediator between order and chaos. And I think that lots of weavers, regardless of the kind of loom you use, you're very intimately aware of this. Thread and yarn have an essential kind of nature or desire, which is to be in tangles. And so much of our technology as weavers, really every tool in a weaving studio, in some way facilitates this arbitration or mediation of chaos. And I always approach this, as a teacher, in a way that is sort of like to prevent the takeover of a project into chaos. But for me, in the studio, I'm realizing more and more that I'm drawn to the places of uncertainty. I'm drawn to the places where things may be right at the edge of control. And so rather than think about the tool as a way to abate chaos, I really think about the loom as a way to touch chaos. It introduces uncertainty into my process, and that is something that I have been cultivating over the last number of years. I don't do very much direct design work on the computer because I'm working with the TC2 loom. Many of you know that there's a fairly elaborate and important process of design we engage, whether that's through Photoshop or through other software, generating imagery or pattern to capture at the loom. I'm much more interested in creating circumstances or algorithms that without my control generate pattern, which I then can capture as thread and cloth at the loom. And I'll talk about that quite a bit later on, but this is sort of the first kind of regard that I'd like to address, the way in which the loom exists at this balance point for me between order and chaos. The second regard that I think about frequently is the way in which the loom is a machine or an engine of abstraction. And that is to say that when we experience a piece of cloth, whether that is visually or in a tactile way, what we're experiencing is a formal interaction with organized thread. And thread as an object on its own is a vehicle for texture and color and these formal properties. But it's the loom which then takes this material and facilitates or allows for the experience of that material as something we touch or something that we see. I really recognize that over the years, I've come to kind of a visual language or perhaps a vernacular that is very in line with the vernacular of painting. So in my work, the thread is not necessarily experienced haptically for the viewer. People don't touch these works. They experience it visually as one might experience a painting. But for me, the important quality that exists in all weaving is that while we may be looking at these objects from a distance as fields of color or pattern or line and texture, on closer inspection, the surface of these works always reveal physicality. And so the relationship to abstraction for me is not one of the kind of illusionistic space of painting as we might understand it through modernity. Instead, there is a physical object which suggests color and pattern, but that physical object never disappears as it might in the blending of painting. Each textile is actually a physical record, very, very clearly. Each thread remains visible, and that's very important to me in terms of the structures that I choose. Laura sort of mentioned my interest in waffle weave, and honestly, the way in which I'm interested in the waffle weave as a structure comes from the high degree of exposure of the individual thread, and it was actually through that that I began exploring these more dimensional qualities of the cloth. So as painting, I'm very interested in the way that from a distance, there's a kind of flatness, a kind of graphic flatness to the work. But that on closer inspection, there's often moments through the waffle weave structure that a certain dimensionality or a certain uncertainty of where the terminus point of the surface is, that there's a depth that somehow goes beyond the surface of our expectation of how a painting sort of ends at the canvas. So that materiality, I often try and push as far as I can at the loom to create these surfaces, which can be experienced from a distance as flat, but on closer inspection, show this kind of dimensionality and this physicality. Finally, I've been thinking about the way that the loom is a machine that archives time. And this is a very, very classical, maybe one of the most ancient metaphors. We relate to the loom and to weaving as a system by which time is captured. And I think many of you may be familiar with the author Madeline Miller, a really incredible scholar and storyteller of Greek mythology. And I love this reference she makes to the one of the famous weavers of Greek mythology, Penelope. And she points out that the word for the upright Greek loom, which Penelope would have used, is histos, which is the same word that is used for the mast of a ship. And so she talks about in the Odyssey, Homer navigating the horizontal plane of the sea through his histos of the ship, so navigating space through the histos of the ship, and Penelope navigating her histos, the loom, in the vertical direction of time. So these two characters bound by love, one exploring the world through the histos of the ship, the other exploring time through the histos of the loom. And we know this, I think, it's another very essential quality that weavers understand, that a piece of cloth is evidence of accumulation, of accretion, so that line by line, a textile is constructed. But most importantly for me, each of those moments, each of those instances of time at the loom remains discrete and visible. That the accumulation of time isn't something that can be hidden or obscured, that in the final textile, those moments of activity are embedded and can be sort of tracked and traced back to a moment of warp interacting with weft. I often think about this when I am in sort of natural history museums looking at, textile from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, that each of those moments remains a discrete moment and is embedded and not lost. It actually can't be hidden. As a weaver, we know that each thread remains visible and tangible. And in many ways, I think of a textile as not only a physical cloth, but also a record and instruction on how to make that cloth. And so I often liken this quality of textile to the way a musical score might exist. So when a pianist hears a piece of music, here's a piece of let's say of Bach, for example, hearing the piece of music, they also are able to reenact or act that piece of music out if they have the skill enough to do that. So I often look at cloth not only as the formal or final object, but also as an instruction, like a perfect record, and can be decoded backwards, back to the moment of making. So my regard for the loom as a piece of technology, as a tool, has really invited me as an artist and really just as a citizen of the world to regard other technologies perhaps more intimately. And as many of you know and have been discussing, I'm sure, in this lecture series, that the primary technology which has really subsumed or stepped to the fore in our lives is the computer. And as we all know, and I'm sure have been discussing as well, that the lineage between loom and computer is one lineage. That's a continuous expression of technology. So in my sort of research and in the time I've spent weaving, I've equally sort of invested in understanding the history of modern computers. And that really finds its its primary tipping point in the punch card jacquard loom. I don't need to explain too much technically what's going on here, but just for the sake of unpacking the slides, we're very lucky at the University of Oregon. My predecessor I teach at the University of Oregon, where I run the fibers program, was very invested in punch card jacquard weaving, and so we have all of the tools to move from gouache designs to gridded paper, and then to translate the gridded paper into punch cards, punch the cards, lash them onto an 18th century jacquard head, and weave in this sort of 18th century way, right next to the TC2 digital jacquard loom. So the students get perhaps a sense of the relationship between the digital and the physical in this really tangible way. And it's quite beautiful, actually, because it's one of these things I think many students now, many people now know the sort of history. It's become quite a popular history, this sort of relationship between punch card jacquard technology and early computing. But the actual physical interaction with the machines that punch the cards and produce this binary expression, there are just little nuances that I feel like are just like any sort of physical practice. When you start doing it, certain narratives and certain kinds of instances step forward in the mind through the physical process. And one of them, which is very interesting, is IBM's first punch card computers, of course, used the jacquard process as sort of direct kind of inspiration. And this machine which we use to punch the cards, the way that it is designed is meant to accommodate kind of physical limitations of the body. So when we're designing for these punch cards, basically there's like a brass. It's foolish of me not to have taken a photo of this, because it's very it's interesting to see. There's a brass kind of dial which you use to punch out the cards. And so you're always punching the cards with your 8 fingers, 8 digits, and then your thumbs sort of advance the cards. So the cards basically all function on multiples of 8. Each card is an expression that is limited to the number 8. And this is one of the reasons why computer memory, like bits and bytes, also operate on multiples of 8. And so this sort of physical limitation of the punch card device is sort of how we get the numerical basis for things like computational memory, which is like a very small moment, perhaps, in the development of these technologies, but that it relates directly back to a physical reality or a property of the physical tools in the weaving studio. It's very interesting to me. So that, our cell phones and our laptops, there is this direct connection back to the weaver's body and the limitations of 8 digits and 2 thumbs. I'm just showing some images of jacquard experiences that our students get to enact at the U of O. I'm very lucky in that my predecessor, Barbara Pickett, for the University of Oregon, created this very tight relationship with the Licio Foundation in Florence, Italy. The Licio Foundation is a really preeminent jacquard silk and velvet weaving studio. So right up until the pandemic, every other year, we would bring students to Florence so they can work on these really this sort of rarefied equipment. And so in terms of studying the relationship between the modern computer and the jacquard loom, something that always struck me was the sort of physical presence of the data. So the Licio Foundation, which houses, is also basically an archive of historic patterns. These cards occupy a huge amount of space. And so there is this kind of physical embodiment of the numerical, which is something we often miss, I think, as modern or contemporary users of computational tech. So, we have this fantasy that the digital is somehow disembodied, or like even our language, like the cloud, for example, suggests that the digital experience is somehow only ephemeral and has no physical implications, which we all, of course, know is inaccurate. But that we simply have deferred the physicality of the digital to places that we don't see, like data centers, for example. There's a huge physical infrastructure to house our digital experiences. But at the Licio Foundation, you have a really clear physical, even architectural sense of data storage. That these cards, the building is the sort of innards of the building are organized around these ramps, so that this tonnage of material, these cards, can be moved from archives to looms. And so to see that, I think, again, is maybe a very small kind of experience for the students, but I think it points to the way in which the digital has a physical presence and the importance of that, and then potentially today the implications of how our digital experiences do involve carbon footprint, and have absolutely measurable physical impact on our planet and on our culture. So, but beyond that, it's also interesting to think about the way in which this technology is industrial. It's allowed. It's hot. We're there in the summer, and there are mosquitoes everywhere, and the amount of concentration you can see on the students' faces, like if you're in the process of punching out a card, you can't really stop. Like if you stop and make a mistake, you sort of you have to start over. So like mosquitoes will land on you, and you just have to keep going. There's a sense of that physicality that's really important. So during this time, I mean, I came to know jacquard weaving through the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. I was very lucky um, to study weaving at a time where the thread controller looms were becoming kind of an institutional um, um, baseline of a lot of weaving studios. And so I was working really at the beginning of my own weaving experience, moving from sort of traditional harness-driven floor looms to jacquard really seamlessly. It did not it was never introduced to me as kind of a something idiosyncratic or special. So it was insinuated in my mind very, very quickly. And because of that, you know, there's a tradition of intellectual inquiry, I think, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago's Vibromaterial Studies program that really emphasized that the tool is not simply a means to an ends, but also a source of conceptual concern. And so to study the tool, its history, the people who used it, the sociopolitical circumstances under which it was developed, this is also content for the work. The tool is not somehow passive. And so as a person who was interested in the loom, interested in modern computing, oh, this is this is so long ago. Here I am, very excited with my punch cards. As a person interested in these technologies, I felt it really behooved me as a weaver also to embark on a study of code and coding in modern computers. And not so much as, initially not so much as a way to make work, but I began studying code as a way to better understand the language of computation. I remember being a young weaver, and like I was actually not so interested in the textile itself, like the cloth that came off the loom. I was much more interested in setting up the loom and drafts and the instructional and the sort of written quality of drafting. That there is this language that in many ways referenced other sorts of forms of art making that I was interested in that time, in particular instructional art of Saul LeWitt and sort of high conceptual instruction-based art. So I would look at drafts in the same way, again, as a reference to music, as kind of this this data that is meant to be interpreted by a weaver, and that pattern and language of weave is something that can be captured almost like choreography or some kind of musical score was really where I was interested in. And I found a direct relationship between drafting and coding at the computer. It's simply a very, very natural kind of relationship. So I started studying coding, um, not as a way to make work, but really to satisfy kind of intellectual curiosity. And of course, through that, um, I began writing code specifically to create patterns to weave at the loom. And so initially, the code I was writing was really simple. You know, though I do a lot of code now, I never consider myself a coder, or like I don't consider myself like a digital artist. But I remember just like spending so many hours like on Reddit learning how to use processing, for example, to create simple drawing tools. And so those tools were often sort of self-generating systems that were working at a pixel level, and I would capture that activity as cloth. And so I wasn't using structure, so to speak. I was really working just at a pixel level. I mean, this was a way for me, I think, to begin this regard for the relationship between order and chaos in the computational environment, both at the computer and at the loom. And I won't go through, these all represent different, like little, very, very short, you know, maybe 30 to 60 lines of code, really, really simple bits of software, where I was doing things like, okay, I would like to write a little drawing tool in which, like, just with a Wacom tablet, that I can draw a line and then have the computer through an algorithmic process also draw a line. So you can imagine on a Wacom tablet, I'm like doodling and the computer is doodling, and we're both doodling to a point that reaches a certain critical mass that I can capture that pixel activity as weaving. And so this is a piece of cloth that came from that experiment. And I spent a lot of time just experimenting with this idea. How can I create circumstances where I'm collaborating with this technology or collaborating with an algorithm to produce a piece of cloth? The early work was all based in this kind of activity. I also was thinking a lot about you know, because I have to translate this data into material, because I'm interested in translating this data into material. I was trying to make formal or material decisions that I felt most closely aligned with the digital space. So initially, the work was all black and white. I just used black mercerized cotton with our white mercerized cotton warp on the TC2 loom. And this was partly because, you know, in a way, it directly references this sort of binary operation of the loom that we see in drafts, the sort of black and white quality. But in weaving at such a fine, really at the pixel level, other sort of qualities began to emerge. So this bit of software is interesting. Basically, what you're seeing is a drawing tool where I would draw at a pixel level, again, like a single kind of sort of lightning shaped line, like a lightning bolt shaped line. And the computer would, it's almost like the stroke tool in Photoshop, sort of extend that line out, echo it out towards the edges of the textile. And what was interesting about this is you can sort of see in the center, the line is very like sort of clearly defined. But as it sort of filled the space, or as it echoed that line out towards the edges, it began to degrade. So there became this quality of kind of a sort of a ghostly sort of degradation of that initial line. which always referenced to me this idea of a ghost in the machine, which is this sort of computational notion that in increasingly complex systems, more and more uncertainty or errant behaviors start to emerge, which again touched upon this interest I've been describing, which is about this balance point between order and chaos, because I don't want to control the total manifestation of what the algorithm does. I create a circumstance where these uncontrollable kind of effects start to appear. But anyway, back to the sort of formal qualities. It's hard to capture in photographs, but because of the way that that line, that horizontal line of the weft, because of its fineness, there was a lot of sort of damask-like qualities to these textiles. So though they look very flat in these images, moving around the cloth, they were very holographic. They captured light in these very in these ways that sort of referenced the way one might experience a piece of damask. Again, this is a very simple piece of software. It was drawing single line, like 1 pixel with wide line, and then the computer sort of extrapolated that line out to the edges. And so in my research around coding and my curiosity around the history of computation, I became really interested in the writing of a historian of computer technology named George Dyson. His book, Turing's Cathedral, in particular. And I actually had a chance to meet George Dyson. He visited the University of Oregon and gave a really wonderful lecture about AI. And one of the narratives he tells about the history of, and he's a very interesting person because he looks at computation as an issue of paleotechnics. So he thinks of computation as an ancient kind of endeavor. And so we often think of modern computation. Maybe we say like the first computer is the loom. He would actually say there are kinds of computers that existed even before the loom. And he thinks about a tree, for example, as a kind of computational device that in the growth of a tree, when we look at the rings of the tree, there is this sort of memory which can be accessed at a later date. And this is how he sort of defines a computer as something that is able to embed ephemeral events that can be withdrawn later or understood at a later date. And so we think about things like kipu, which is the knot tying, a knot tying mathematical language, and other sorts of forms of computational technologies. Anyway, I think he's interesting because of that. That has not much to do with the image you're seeing on the screen right now. But when he came to lecture, he told this story about the history of computers, which just struck me so deeply. It sort of lodged itself in my thinking, and has continued to be the source of a lot of the work I'm making. But this story is about early supercomputing, and so we're thinking about computers like ENIAC and at the Institute for Advanced Studies in New Jersey, the sort of early supercomputers, which were essentially weaponized during the Second World War. So the story he tells is that, and many of you who have seen like films like oh, what is it? The Christopher Nolan film about the Manhattan Project. The title is escaping me for some reason. Does anyone remember? Do people know what I'm talking about?
The one that just came out?
Oppenheimer.
There you go.
Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
Of course. Many people recognize this narrative in which during the development of the atomic bomb, the calculus of the blast yield of the device was really beyond human capabilities to calculate. And so we turned to these supercomputers to more accurately determine the blast yield of the bomb. And so he describes that these computers, they were also used to calculate blast trajectories. This was sort of the first instance in which computation as a modern endeavor is utilized, is weaponized. And we know from the effects at Hiroshima and Nagasaki how effective this sort of most horrible calculus turned out to be. But after the development of the bomb, these supercomputers were largely decommissioned by the military, the U.S. military, and so the scientists were sort of given an opportunity. Basically, the government was like, "We don't need computers in our war effort anymore, but please continue to utilize them." The programmers and engineers at the Institute for Advanced Studies, where this work was being done, were invited to basically create an open call for researchers around the world to come to the US. Basically, we have the most powerful computer in existence. Bring us your unsolvable problems, and we'll collaborate to answer them. And these are some of the programmers who were part of this initial kind of call for entry. And the project that they chose, so immediately after working on the atomic bomb, the project that they chose to collaborate with was a proposal by the mathematician biologist Nils Aall Baricelli. And he was interested, his proposal was to model the way in which single cell organisms grow, evolve, and survive catastrophe. So the parity of the proximity of these two projects, first, the supercomputer used to create the most destructive force our species has ever endeavored to enact, immediately following that, a project to understand the origins of life and ongoingness. The fact that this one device is sort of sits between these two projects is such a powerful, poetic and compelling contrast to me. I just knew I had to do something. I didn't know what it was, but just the way that the regard for that technology, again, struck me as something really compelling, and in many ways, I think informs how I think about all technology as somehow sitting between our really high ideals and our propensity for destruction. Like, we can talk about that more later, but basically, I got Baricelli's white papers. I did not understand what was going on in here mathematically, so I began collaborating with a software engineer, Michael Mack, who has since become one of my most important collaborators. And so we looked through Baricelli's work, and he explained a lot of the mathematics to me. But just upon looking at a lot of the outputs and the diagrams he was producing, I just saw weaving. Like, this all just looked like weaving to me, like looked like drafts, looked like textile. And the way I can unpack it for you, if you look on the right, it might be hard to see on your screens, but this printout, of course, Baricelli was not working with screens. They were working with basically paper printouts from the supercomputer. What he devised was a way to program organisms. And he would give these individual organisms different personalities. So some of the organisms were more passive. Some of them were more aggressive. Others were only interested in mating. Others were only interested in consuming resources. And so at the very bottom, the x-axis, this first line of numbers, each of those numbers represents an organism with a personality. The next line, so moving up one line in the y-axis, is the second generation. So that first generation interacts through their personalities, produces a second generation, on and on and on and on, until you see this map, basically a genealogy. And you can see how some of the organisms disappear, like they lose the evolutionary battle. Others become really, really successful and start taking over large areas of the virtual space. But even that, the way he would describe this sort of line by line, sort of accreting of this system, spoke to me directly to weaving, which is, as you know, created in this weft line by line way. So what I did with my collaborator, Michael, is we looked at this code, and for Baricelli, the organisms were represented by a number, but we devised a way to represent the organisms as weave structures. So the best way you can think about it, I think, is like the organisms unchanged from Baricelli's software in the 1950s. We took that and dressed the organisms up in different weave structures. And it's through those same interactions that weave structures would get combined, others would disappear and get destroyed. And through a lot of iteration, we were able to start creating textile that looked like this. So it's, I talk about this as though it happened like over a weekend or something. This was a lot of months of, of trial and error. Ultimately, a year of just lots of failures, unweavable things. But we began, so this is an example of shaded satins, a very beloved structure in TC2 jacquard weaving. And so each of these rectangles, this is one organism. Basically, each color represents an organism. In the draft, it looked very like familiar as a shaded satin kind of draft, but there would be moments where very unpredictable things would start happening, like the way the structures would blend together, the offspring generation after generation, other behaviors like in the translation from that digital space to the physical cloth, really very unpredictable events started taking place. So I was very happy uh, you know, that again, I was not designing, this piece of cloth. It was algorithmically being generated. And of course, I was making color choices as a design element, but that in a way I could simply grow this piece of cloth indefinitely, and it would continue over millions of generations to produce this ongoing piece of cloth. Um, and so I could not really figure out what to do with the textile initially. I was like, is this, how do I want this to exist in the world? Is it going to be, um, uh, uh, could it be garment? It could be something installed in space. But there was a line in George Dyson's writing about Baricelli's work where he described Baricelli's software as an abstraction of the theory of evolution. And so that word abstraction, which we understand, say, from Greenberg and the modern painters like Lee Krasner, this idea that abstraction must come from life. This is sort of an edict that the abstract painters put forward. Here were textiles that were, like, in many ways, virtual life. And Baricelli talked about his digital organisms as digital life. And it made a lot of sense to me in that case to return that digital life to the vernacular of abstraction. And so they became these kinds of paintings. And something that I realized through this process, like bringing these textiles into this sort of stretched surface, one of the qualities that I really wanted to emphasize was the way in which, as a weaver, so many of the formal decisions or the material decisions I make at the loom all happen under tension, right? The loom is under tension, I weave under tension. And then there's always this dramatic transformation when the cloth comes off the loom and becomes an object in the world. I wanted to keep those decisions that I made under tension at the final product. So returning them to this stretch space, to sort of return it to this point of tension, made a lot of sense to me. And so I can dress up these organisms in all kinds of structures. So these were shaded, the Baricelli software as shaded satins. This is the Baricelli software as waffle weave. And so it's the same interactions, but now the organisms are the individual sort of unit of a waffle weave. And as they interact, you can also see areas where organisms disappear and where they are more successful in certain areas. And so this has been like a primary kind of, in the last 5 years, really, all of my work has come from this software. And what has been interesting is to sort of play with the way in which like the formal qualities of this, that introducing the very strict parameter of this software has allowed me to explore more intuitively and maybe more materially um, color and line. And it is really within the strict limitations of weaving, but more so the strict limitations of this software that this sort of formal play can occur. And I think that's a very Weaverly kind of attitude, that we are always working with this piece of technology, which has fairly strict parameters, but the ability to invent, or the ability to play, comes out of those parameters. Um, so I did this a lot, and it was interesting. One of the things that my collaborator Michael, and this is one of the wonderful things about collaboration. It's why I really I love the state of collaboration, and I really encourage my students to do it. Is, I'm not an engineer, and I'm not a coder. I'm a weaver and an artist, and because of that, I have limitations. I can't see all of the questions that potentially an engineer might have. And one of the questions that Michael brought up is like, Baricelli was really limited in terms of the amount of computational power the supercomputer had in the 1950s. Today, we can ask questions of these organisms that Baricelli couldn't. Baricelli was interested primarily in ongoingness and survival. But what if we ask questions about destruction or disappearance of organisms or extinction? What if we ask questions about climate change? And so all of these textiles dealt more with those questions. So branching off from Baricelli's original set, we began to program organisms that that did other kinds of things. And so the complexity of the structures began to reflect those new questions. And I just want to, I'm speeding up a little bit because I'm aware of time, but um, the last project I want to talk about is something forthcoming, exhibition in New York that'll open in April. I had a chance to visit a really important site, I think, for weavers, and that's the necropolis at Mitla in Oaxaca, in Mexico. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a really important site archaeologically, because it's very well known that the facades, all of the walls of this building are decorated. Decorated is even perhaps the wrong word, are embedded with very sacred weave structures from the local warp-faced weaving techniques of that region. And primarily the understanding of this space when you visit it as a site. And I was interested in this space because of I had written a research proposal to look at um, weaving cultures that were touched by Spanish conquest. I'm from the Philippines, which is a product of Spanish colonialism. And so I was also visiting these sites in Mexico. Anyway, that the understanding of this building, when you walk through it architecturally, it's like a labyrinth. It makes no sense kind of as a building. There are lots of dead ends and corridors that don't go anywhere. But the idea was that the weave structures represent pathways between the worlds. And that weavers were gifted with this ability to navigate seen and unseen worlds. And the building itself, the hallways were not really meant for practical purposes. They were meant for ritual purposes. So when an individual died, their body would be moved through this space in a very, very specific sequence of hallways to facilitate the spirit entering the next life in a specific way. Essentially, it's like these are circuits. These are pathways, like in a computer, but for the processing of sacred data of this soul. So I was really interested in how I might relate to these structures. And I began writing a piece of software with the help of a local weaver to translate some of these patterns and to use the patterning with my software to try and enact a textile that was a kind of navigation of the seen and unseen. Um, I'm this is still in process. So again, I have lots of, this is also agave fiber, which I was creating and working with in Oaxaca. But this is sort of where the research is now. It has some different qualities, and I'm really interested in how these will um, realize themselves as work. So I'm sorry, I went a little bit over time, but I'm thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer questions. I know that Stephen and Edda are collecting your questions, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Jovencio. I'll turn it back over to Stephen, but hopefully we can give you a warm virtual round of applause. I'm removing the pin so the rest of the audience becomes visible. If you have your camera off, that's fine. Maybe drop something in the chat just to say that you're here and listening and all that. Really moving work, Jovencio. So many beautiful parallels. So much like presence of the ineffable, which I also really love. I think there's an interesting tension between coding and weaving and the kind of like legacies and histories that you would know the name of somebody who wrote the algorithm, or that you would, um, yeah, I don't know, or that you would need to like decode the cloth back to the original data. I was wondering if you'd say a little more about your relationship to decoding when it comes to the kind of translation of computation into cloth. Is that the goal, or are you looking for something different in that moment?
I'm sorry, can you say it one more time, the decoding of the
Yeah, like are you looking for the cloth to be legible in a way where you
uh,
want people to unpack the data, or are you looking for a different space to open up?
yeah, I think that there's lots of components of the work that will always be inaccessible to a general viewer. That that for me, like my nerdiness or my investment into the code is sort of like the way I have to begin. And I think this is actually true for all kinds of weaving. Like very few people will recognize the name of that particular twill or overshot combination that you're using. But the that they are sort of, when I look through like a pattern book, like a classic pattern book, and see these sort of instances of patterns that have been designed by our forebearers in weaving, and I really think about them as sort of musical notations. And it's sort of like the way in which a composer um, codes a piece of music, like writes a piece of music. They sort of establish a parameter in which an artist, performer lives in their language, in the language of someone else, in the mind of someone else. And so I liken a lot of drafting and pattern in weaving to that. Only some of these patterns are so fundamental to sort of human ingenuity. So I think about plane weave. It's almost like discovering fire, right? Every time you light a fire, you're actually enacting a series of gestures which is embedded so deeply into our species. It's almost like an extension of the body or an extension of our genetics. So when you weave plane weave, it's similar to me. It's sort of like the code is so simple, it's so essential. And then from that, like, we can manipulate fire to do so many things. We can manipulate this over and under to do so many things. And people attach their names to it sometimes, often people don't. Um, but the decoding for a viewer, I don't think is as important to me as sort of the kind of latent or nascent use the word ineffable, which is like kind of ringing in my mind. I do think there's something ineffable about it, but also there, in some instances, it's very effable. Like these patterns, this sort of Greca Zapoteca is the name of this pattern, has a name. It is specific to a people and a lineage. So those are tensions which are really important also to point to. Um, I'm very interested in the work of Ada Dietz. Are people familiar? Dietz, perhaps is yeah. So like a mathematician who, um, the reason why I'm interested in it is like, she, for those of you who aren't familiar, she created a formulaic way to draft. So using polynomials to create weave structures. No one, I think, if anyone actually uses her system, I would love to talk to you because I know she went on like these tours to weaving guilds to be like, oh, you can write all of your drafts as algebra basically, and no one does it. But um, I'm sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent, but the ingenuity or the way in which we author these algorithms or these patterns, I think is not the goal for me, but it is such a rich evidence of human ingenuity that I sort of dwell there often. So I'm not sure if that answered your question at all, but
I don't know if it was a question that had an answer, so you did exactly what I wanted you to do. Stephen, maybe you can curate something from the chat and we'll
Yeah,
wrap up.
yeah, absolutely. There's a couple questions, and I just want to thank you again for your talk. And I love so many of these comments that I will take with me. The idea that plane weave is like discovering fire. Like, thanks. I'm going to quote that for 20 years. Um, it's like so good. And also the conversation that you had before about time being hidden in a textile but being readable, and that was such a great arc in your lecture. I'm just gonna be out of here and say that's such a great arc to the end of your lecture where you're reading these ancient cultural texts out of the stone. But actually, I wanted to ask some questions that came up in the chat that are really about your practice more particularly. I'm going to combine two questions, one from Heather and one from Etta, about your choices, some of the choices that you make in your final displays and some of the choices you make in your textile. You say you're intervening with these patterns with particular colors. And I wondered if you could just talk for just a minute about the way you make those choices. And then secondarily, Etta had a question about the way in which you display these textiles that have been so informed by coding, and then you're sort of framing them inside of the fabric. And is that fabric that you wove, or how are you
yeah.
making that final choice of the framing? It's very unique, and I imagine you'll start to see it in other people's practice.
Let me answer your the second question, then I'll talk about the first one. Um, the it's it's interesting when I was studying when I was an undergrad at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, like when I was 18 years old, I wanted to be a painter. This was really clear to me. And at that time, though, when I was in art school, the conversations that were happening in painting weren't really speaking to me. And so that's sort of how I moved to fiber material studies, really by happenstance. But when I was, the conversations I wanted to have in painting were actually about like identity and labor, and those conversations were not happening so much in painting department, but they were happening in fiber. But I was raised in kind of an intellectual tradition by uh, I'd say mentors who really encouraged some suspicion around the history of painting, that this was seen perhaps as a politically antithetical kind of endeavor, that there was a relationship, there was a history of painting that was patriarchal, that was particularly white and male, and that if you're going to study fiber, there's a different lineage you should be working through, which is more about the object and body and installation. And I took this really seriously. And this is something I think about a lot as a teacher myself. Some of these comments were very offhand, and I'm not like blaming. I loved my time in the fiber material studies program, but I took this really to heart. And actually, it took me about 15 years to go back to the questions about painting that I had wanted to ask as a student at that time. And in part, there so in part, the display is a way for me to return to this what feels like a very native language to me, which is this kind of picture plane of the painting. But I had mentioned the stretching also resolved this issue for me, which is like the decisions that I make, which I'm very particular about in the process of weaving, because they happen under tension. I'm building sort of the cloth under these very, very specific parameters, which I actually want to preserve in the final presentation. And then the sort of abundance of white negative space. What I realized very, very quickly when there were textiles, I think I showed you the early works where the fabric more or less goes all the way to the edge and then wraps around the canvas. I felt a lot of loss in that process. There was like, in some ways, some of the fabric became sort of superfluous or inconsequential as it wrapped around the edges of the frame. So I wanted to center, like, share the entire experience of the cloth. So I sort of added those borders. But as a result of that, I also realized that the visual space, because of the high level of kind of complexity and color, texture, pattern, in order to actually give the viewer a sort of a resting point or a neutral space felt really important. I began using cotton canvas from Dharma Trading Company, but I'm weaving a lot of that fabric. So it's interesting. A lot of my practice now also involves just like hours of weaving like plain white work twill or canvas, which then I use as that negative space. So the new exhibition in New York will highlight a lot of work where I'd say more of the surface is handwoven. Your first question about color, it's interesting. So I began using black and white because of some fidelity I wanted to have to the black and white pixel that I was working with on the screen. But after that, I started using process color. So cyan, magenta, yellow, red, like the process color of the screen. And then after that, I started, incrementally introducing color that I was interested in for other reasons. So like I use a lot of indigo in my work. It's a material that has a very particular kind of histories I'm interested in terms of colonization and globalization. So that appears quite a bit. And then now, working with spinners and fiber producers directly to sort of think about color traditions that are specific to the cultural references I'm making has become important. Um, yeah, and I'm not sure if that answered the question, but again, I think thread being a vehicle for color is something that is always interesting to me. Like it's not flat, and so it is like there's so many opportunities to play with the dimensionality, like through the waffle weave, for example. So even though I'm choosing like a pink yarn, that pink actually has lots of different qualities that through weaving can be emphasized through structure and through combination and optical blending. So yeah.
Yeah, you can really see that even in that totally black composition that you had that was like a void, like a beautiful, beautiful void. Yeah, I can really see like the even in yeah, this is colorless, right? But I really see how you're featuring that darkness with that texture and how thoughtful it is in that. So thank you so much for those insights and your work. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. We're about 10 minutes over. I want to thank you so much for being here. There were so many great questions here in the chat, but I do think we should probably let everybody go this morning. Jovencio, thank you so much. I'm going to let Laura make a few announcements, and I do just want to remind people that our next lecture is on March 21st, and that's going to be at a little bit of a different time for us. It will be on a Friday morning instead of a Wednesday morning. So if you've been setting aside these Wednesday mornings, just mentally prepare for a Friday morning for our next lecture. Laura, please, our end announcements.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say thank you so much. We look forward to seeing everyone at the next talk. Jovencio, where is your show in New York and when can
Oh,
we see it?
so the show is at PPOW Gallery, and that will open April 16th. No, May 16th. May 16th. Yeah.
Okay.
Just give myself a little bit of a panic attack.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I think, yeah, I think we're all really looking forward to seeing it and hearing more about it and following your work. And thank you so much for sharing it. Super
You're so
inspiring.
welcome. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you.